Right, guys, welcome to lesson 3.1. In this lesson, guys, we're going to be reviewing some absolute value stuff. Unit 3 is focusing on two special types of functions that are closely related to each other. One is the absolute value function. The other one, which we'll kind of get to towards the end, is something called a piecewise function. But for the first few lessons, we're going to be talking about absolute values. So what are we going to talk about with absolute values today in specific? Well, today we're talking about how to solve absolute value equations. All right, so before we begin, let's go ahead and review what absolute value is. Absolute value is a distance from 0 on the number line. So distances are always a positive measurement. Just like when you were back in geometry, you were looking for the side of a triangle, you never should have gotten an answer like -10, because when you're talking about shapes which involve lengths and distance, you never get negatives. So absolute value is just basically the length of something or the distance of something. So if I say what's the absolute value of -5, I'm asking how many steps away from 0 is it, and the answer is 5. Okay. And likewise, if I ask you what's the absolute value of 5, that one's also 5. So I don't want you guys to think that absolute value changes the sign. It doesn't. What it does is it just tells you how many steps away from 0 it is. Okay? So that's what absolute value is. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some other stuff here. So question mark is in the absolute value symbol there. What's the answer? Well, hopefully you know that there are two answers to that question. The answer is both 9 and -9, right? There are two numbers that have an absolute value of 9. There are two numbers, that is to say, that are 9 spaces away from 0, and the answer is 9 and -9. What goes in this blank? What number has an absolute value of -9? Now, this is a bogus question. This has no solution. Okay? Because it's impossible for an absolute value to give you a negative outcome. Now, that doesn't mean you can't put a negative inside the absolute value bars. You can, but as soon as you put a negative inside the absolute value bars, the output becomes a positive. Okay? But there is no case where you could ever plug something in here and the output comes out to be negative, because absolute value will always result in a positive value because it's a distance from 0. So here's our summary then. Absolute values very often give us two answers whenever we're wondering what could be inside here. But if it's ever equal to a negative, that oftentimes results in saying no solution at all. All right? So using that fact, we're going to go ahead and move on to some example problems here. So instead of a question mark now, I'm using the letter X, but that's the same thing as just saying question mark. We just don't know what it is. So what number or numbers have an absolute value of 4? Well, hopefully you know now that the answer is +4 and -4. Okay, so we end up with two solutions for number 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. On number 2, the absolute value of what number is -3? Well, that's impossible. No number has an absolute value of -3 because it always has to be positive. So our answer to number 2 would be no solution. Now, number 3 is a little bit different, okay? So whenever you have more than just an X inside of the absolute value bars, it's a little bit different. So here's how we're going to approach it. Whatever is inside the absolute value bars has an absolute value of 12, okay? That doesn't mean that X has an absolute value of 12. That means that whatever is inside the absolute value bars has an absolute value of 12. And what that means is that that stuff inside the absolute value bars can either be equal to -12 or it can be equal to a +12. Okay? So instead of getting two answers right away, what we get is two equations. And those two equations will give us two different answers. I add 6 to a negative 12, I get negative 6. And if I add 6 to 12, I get 18. Okay? So, unlike number 1, where you get the same number twice, just one's positive and negative, when you have more stuff inside the absolute value bars, especially adding or subtracting numbers, you get two different answers completely. They're not even opposite sign answers. Completely different. So the strategy here is to take whatever's in the absolute value bars and make it equal to a negative and positive version of the distance that they give you, and then solve both equations. Okay? Let's do one more like that. Now this one is actually special as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. So if I were to follow my steps on this problem, I would say, okay, whatever's inside the absolute value bars is going to be equal to a negative, whatever the distance is, and a positive, whatever that distance is. But here's the thing, guys. Negative 0 and positive 0 are the same thing. So when you put a negative in front of a 0, it doesn't really matter, right? So let me go ahead and say then that since we have 0, we don't need to write the equation twice. We only need to do it once. So that's another special circumstance. So here's what we learned. Ready? Okay, so we learned that absolute values give you two answers. That one did, and like this one did. That's pretty much what usually happens. But when you have just an X on the inside, you just get the same answer twice. But one's a positive, one's a negative. But when you have this, you get two completely different answers. Right? Now, if it's ever equal to 0, though, you do get an answer. There's just only one of them, though. Because anytime it equals 0, there's no such thing as a plus and minus 0. So you just get one answer for those. And if it ever equals a negative, there is no solution. So that's our summary there. So usually absolute values give you two answers, but it's possible they can give you one or none, depending on what's it's set equal to. All right? So go ahead and try these 4 problems and pause the video. When you unpause it, you will see the problem. Okay, so here's your solutions. Number 1, you should have gotten plus and minus 6. Number 2, since it equals 0, you only get one answer, which is negative 2. And for number 3, since it equals 9, you're going to write two equations, one where x minus 8 equals negative 9, and one where it equals a positive 9. Solving both of those, you would end up with negative 1 and 17. And then the last one is going to have no solution because absolute values are not possible to be set equal to a negative number like that. So that's student practice 1. Let's go ahead and move on to our next set. Okay, so these next set of problems here are a little bit different because they have numbers that are outside of the absolute value bars. So for these ones, the key is to get rid of, it says get rid, well, get rid of outside numbers first. So, for instance, on number 1, I have two numbers that are outside of the absolute value bars on the left side of the equation here, the 4 and the 2, and I need to get rid of those first before we do anything else. So that's the goal there on all these problems, is to get rid of the outside numbers before you do any solving or come to any conclusion. So we have 4 absolute value of x plus 2 equals 6. Now to solve this, we're going to just follow some simple algebra here. Minus the 2 on both sides. Divide both sides by 4. Now as soon as you've got that done, the problem becomes just like the ones that we did on the last page. Okay, and so the answer number 1 will be plus and minus 1. Okay? let's go ahead and take a look at number 2 there. Start off the same way. We're going to subtract on both sides. Divide. After you get rid of your outside numbers, you have this, and we know that's not possible, right? So now we say no solution. Absolute values cannot be equal to a negative number, okay? Let's go ahead and take a look at another one here. And just so you guys know, it's technically possible for me to put a negative right here. That's okay. It's after you get rid of all the outside numbers. If it's still negative when you just have the absolute value equal to a negative, that's when you say no solution. But if there's outside numbers, it's definitely possible for the absolute value to have a negative on the other side. So let me give you an example. So like, for instance, we all know that this is okay, right? Absolute value of x equals 2. There's nothing wrong with that. But if I multiply both sides by a -1, there's nothing wrong with that move that I just did. So the reason why the right side is negative is because I multiplied it by a -1. And if I get rid of that outside number by dividing it out, it goes back to being okay. So it's okay for there to be a negative over here so long as after you get rid of the outside numbers, there is no more negative, okay? When you get down to the point where you just have an absolute value with a number on the other side, there should not be a negative on the other side, okay? All right, anyway, let's go ahead and move on to number 3. For number 3, the temptation for this one that you need to avoid is you might want to distribute. So some of you guys might want to distribute this 2 in here. I'm going to say don't distribute into absolute values. Now, the reason why sometimes it's okay, you can, sometimes you can't. And so I'm just going to say just don't do it at all. Now, the reason why it's not okay is because when you put a number inside, it's going to force it to become positive, right? Now, since this 2 is already a positive, if you were to distribute, you'd actually be okay on this problem because it's not going to change the value of the 2. But if this was a -2 outside of the bars here and you distributed it, you would actually end up with a wrong answer. So as a general rule of thumb, we just don't want to practice bad algebra. So let's make a rule here. We're not going to distribute when it comes to absolute values. So what do we do to solve a problem that looks like this instead? Well, let's take a look. The first thing we're going to do is do any sort of adding or subtracting that's possible. So for instance, minus the 5 on both sides. That would be the first thing I would do. Now, instead of distributing this 2 into the parentheses, or I'm sorry, the absolute value bars, since it's 2 times the absolute value, to get rid of the 2, we can just do the opposite of multiplication, and we can divide the 2 out like that. And whatever we do to one side, just do to the other. Okay, so that's how we'll get rid of those numbers. All right, so now I've got it down to, I've gotten rid of the outside numbers. I got rid of the 5 and I got rid of the 2. Okay, now we're going to continue because we're not done with this problem yet. We still have to solve for x, right? But now that it's just an absolute value problem like the last set of problems we did, we know what to do from here, right? From here, what we do is, oops, I miswrote the problem. What we do is we make 2 equations. One where it's 2x plus 3 equals a -8, and one where it's 2x plus 3 equals a +8. Okay? and then we solve both. Sorry, I was having some technical issues there for a second. Here's one. And here's our other one. So negative 11 halves and 5 halves. So we learned a couple things from number 3. For number 3, we learned that you don't distribute with absolute values, you divide this number out. We also learned, we reviewed also that after you get that done, you still have the 2 equation thing, right? There's more than just that. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 4 now. So number 4, we have this. All right, so let's follow the same steps here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to minus the 10 on both sides. Next, we're going to divide the 5 because we're not going to distribute it, right? And then we're going to say that if x plus 3 has an absolute value of 2, that means that x plus 3 can either be negative 2 or positive 2. And then we just solve both. One answer, another one. So this one was just kind of repetitive. It's just like number 4, but a little bit less instruction there and just more practice, really. One other thing before I turn you guys loose on this. I have seen problems like this. So let's go ahead and add a number 5 really quick here. I want you guys to be prepared for something else that could come up. I've seen problems presented like this. Okay, so when we have this, what you have to understand is, first of all, it doesn't matter. I've been putting the numbers always on the right side, what it's equal to, right? But it could be on the left. That doesn't matter. Another thing is that a lot of, for the way I like to write them, a lot of time it's kind of written like this. You have a number in the front, you have your stuff on the inside, and then you have a plus or a minus number here, and then you have the answer it equals here. But it's possible that somebody might take the C part here and put it in the front. Okay. And if they do that, now, you could have a plus or a minus here now as well, but it's really the same thing. So that's what this one is that we're looking at right now. What we're going to do is the way that you would solve this one here is first of all, you would minus the 7 on both sides, right? And that would give me 3 is equal to negative. That negative does not disappear. It's still there, x plus 1. Now, since there's a negative there, guys, what that means is that there's technically, you could think of that as like a negative 1, right? Now, we can't distribute that negative 1 into the parentheses. Remember, we're not allowed to do that. So what do? We divide it out. I'm running a little bit out of space. But yeah, if you ever have a negative in front of your absolute values, that just means it's a negative 1. And the way you get rid of it is by dividing it out. Now, as we said before, an absolute value, once you get rid of all the outside numbers, an absolute value is not allowed to equal a negative. Like on this one, so that would be no solution. So just be aware, sometimes they can present the problem so it looks a little bit different. Also, if there's ever a minus in front of your absolute value, that really means it's being multiplied by a -1, and the way you get rid of it is by dividing it. Okay, so that kind of covers all of our bases. Let's go ahead and have you guys try some student practice problems here, see what you guys get. Pause the video, and when you're all done, you should see the solutions. Okay, guys, so here's your solution. Number 1, minus the 2, divide by 3. We get absolute value of x is 2, which results in plus and minus 2. For number 2, after you divide the -8 on both sides, you have an absolute value set equal to a negative, which is impossible, so that's no solution. Number 3, minus the 4, divide the 5, and we have absolute value of 7 minus x is equal to 1, so we write two equations. 7 minus x equals -1, and 7 minus x equals +1. And for each of those, we're going to subtract 7 and divide by a -1 to get the x by itself, which results in two answers, 8 and 6. Number 4, same steps as number 3 in the beginning at least. Minus the 4, divide the 2. But then after that, we have an absolute value being set equal to a negative, which isn't possible. So that's also a no problem there. All right. That does it for today. So we're done with solving absolute value equations, and we'll see you guys next time.